Frederick, Colorado, is a town that embodies the modern American dream. It's part of a sprawling suburban landscape north of Denver, where new, spacious homes are built in neat, winding communities with names that evoke tranquility and family. Windham Hill, Wren Valley, Sawtooth. It's a place designed for young families, for couples seeking refuge from the city, a place of sprawling parks, good schools, and wide, safe streets where children can ride their bicycles. The Rocky Mountains provide a majestic backdrop, a constant reminder of nature's beauty, while the homes themselves are monuments to domestic achievement. In 2018, the Watts family was the poster family for this dream. They lived in a large, 5-bedroom house on Saratoga Trail, a home they had built just a few years earlier. From the outside, their life looked like a perfectly curated social media feed, and in many ways, it was. Shanann Watts was a force of energy. At 34, she was vibrant, driven, and exceptionally outgoing. She was a natural salesperson, a promoter for a multi-level marketing lifestyle company called Level, which sold patches, shakes, and supplements under the brand name Thrive. Shanann was a star promoter, constantly posting on Facebook, sharing live videos of her life, her family, and the products she believed in. Her posts were a cascade of positivity, motivational quotes, and loving tributes to her family. Her husband, 33-year-old Chris Watts, was her perfect counterpart. Where Shanann was talkative and effervescent, Chris was quiet, reserved, and seemed content to be the steady anchor to her balloon. He was handsome, famously shy, and appeared to be a completely devoted, hands-on father. In Shanann's videos, he was the dutiful husband, smiling softly, helping with the children, the reliable rock of the family. And then there were the children, the heart of their perfect world. Bella, 4 years old, was bright and sensitive, with her mother's expressive eyes. Celeste, 3, known as Cece, was the feisty, adventurous one, a tiny ball of energy. In the summer of 2018, the family was on the verge of expanding. Shanann was 15 weeks pregnant with their third child, a boy they had already named Nico. Shanann's Facebook feed painted a picture of pure domestic bliss. Videos of the girls singing, dancing, and shouting, "Daddy, you're my hero!" Photos of Chris rubbing her pregnant belly. Gushing posts about her husband. "I love this man. He's the best father us girls could ask for." This was the image they presented, and it was an image most of Frederick believed. They were the ideal family in an ideal town. But behind the facade of the $400,000 home, the matching outfits, and the Thrive patches, the foundation of the Watts family was crumbling. The financial pressure was immense. The large house came with a large mortgage, over $3,000 a month. They had car payments, student loans, and significant credit card debt. In 2015, they had filed for bankruptcy, listing over $70,000 in unsecured debt. Despite Shanann's success with Level and Chris's steady job as an operator for Anadarko Petroleum, they were living paycheck to paycheck, drowning in the effort to maintain the very image of success they projected. The personal cracks were just as deep. The couple had recently spent 6 weeks apart while Shanann and the girls visited family in North Carolina. This time apart had not, as Shanann hoped, made their hearts grow fonder. For Chris, it had offered a taste of a different kind of life, a life of freedom, a life without the constant pressure of family, finances, and fatherhood. It was a life he had begun to secretly explore. On the night of August 12, 2018, Shanann Watts returned home from a business trip to Arizona. Her friend and colleague Nicole Atkinson dropped her off at her Saratoga Trail home just before 2 a.m. on Monday, August 13th. The house was quiet. Chris was home, and the girls were asleep in their beds. The next morning, Nicole Atkinson began to worry. Shanann, who lived on her phone and was religious about her business, was unresponsive. She missed a scheduled doctor's appointment at 10 a.m., where she was supposed to hear her unborn son's heartbeat. Nicole tried texting, then calling. Every call went straight to voicemail. This was not like Shanann. By 12:10 p.m., a knot of dread in her stomach, Nicole Atkinson drove to the Watts home. Shanann's car was in the garage. She knocked on the door. No answer. She called the Frederick Police Department and requested a welfare check. An officer arrived and met a frantic Nicole. They were soon joined by Chris Watts, who arrived home from work. He had been in contact with Nicole, but seemed strangely calm, almost unconcerned. He told the officer he had no idea where Shanann was. He said they'd had an emotional conversation when she got home, but that was it. He unlocked the front door and let the officer inside. The house was pristine, eerily so. Shanann's purse was on the kitchen counter. Her cell phone was on the sofa table in the entryway. Her wedding ring was on the nightstand. The beds were stripped, the sheets in a pile, but there was no sign of Shanann, Bella, or Celeste. Chris, under the watchful eye of the officer's body camera, moved through the house with a bizarre lack of urgency. He pointed out his wife's phone, her ring. He seemed more like a confused observer than a frantic husband and father. He mentioned that Shanann had talked about taking the girls to a friend's house to play, but he couldn't remember the friend's name. The officer, sensing something was wrong, asked a neighbor, Nate Trinastitch, to check his home security camera. The camera was pointed directly at the Watts driveway. This single piece of technology would become the key to unraveling the entire case. Chris Watts stood on the neighbor's porch, watching the footage. He was visibly nervous, his hands clasped behind his back, rocking on his heels. The footage showed Chris's truck, and at 5:27 a.m. that very morning, the camera captured him backing his truck up to the garage. He was seen loading items into the truck bed. He was moving quickly, purposefully. He was the only adult seen leaving the house that morning. There was no sign of Shanann or his children. Watching the footage, Chris's story began to change. He now suggested Shanann must have left after he went to work, but the camera showed that was impossible. Shanann's car was still there. The Frederick Police Department knew this was no ordinary missing persons case. They launched a full-scale investigation, and the media descended on the quiet suburban street. On Tuesday, August 14th, less than 48 hours after his family vanished, Chris Watts stood on his own front porch, surrounded by news cameras, and gave one of the most chilling interviews in the history of true crime. He looked directly into the camera, his face a mask of mild concern. "Last night, I had an emotional conversation with her," he said. "I just want them back. I just want them to come back." He spoke of his children. "Bella, she's a little light. Cece, she is just a firecracker." He even forced a small, pained smile. "This house is not complete without anybody here. Please, just bring them back." There were no tears. There was no desperation. There was only a hollow, rehearsed performance. He was not a grieving husband. He was an actor playing a part, and he was failing. To the detectives watching, his demeanor was a massive red flag. They knew he was lying. The only question was why. The investigation moved at lightning speed. The FBI and the Colorado Bureau of Investigation were called in. They began to tear Chris Watts' life apart, and the image of the perfect family man disintegrated within hours. They pulled his phone records. They discovered he was involved in an intense affair with a co-worker from Anadarko, a 30-year-old woman named Nicole Kessinger. The affair had been going on for weeks, blossoming during the time Shanann and the girls were in North Carolina. This wasn't a casual fling, it was a serious relationship. Chris and Nicole were talking about a future, about building a life together. Chris had even told her he was in the process of separating from his wife. The motive, which had been a fog, snapped into sharp focus. It was the oldest motive in the book, a new life, a fresh start. But it was more than just love, it was financial. The investigators uncovered the full extent of the Watts' financial ruin. The bankruptcy, the maxed-out credit cards, the impending homeowners association lawsuit for non-payment, the $400,000 mortgage they were struggling to afford. Shanann's pregnancy, the addition of a third child, wasn't a joy for Chris. It was a financial anchor, one more chain holding him to a life he was desperate to escape. His mistress, Nicole Kessinger, represented everything he wanted: freedom, excitement, and a future with no debt and no responsibilities. His family, Shanann, Bella, Celeste, and the unborn Nico, had become obstacles. The detectives realized what the neighbor's security camera had shown them. Chris Watts hadn't just been loading tools into his truck at 5:27 a.m. He was loading the bodies of his family. On Wednesday, August 15th, detectives brought Chris Watts to the Frederick Police Station. They told him it was just a formality, a few more questions. They placed him in an interview room. They had one more card to play, a polygraph test. For hours, Chris sat with the examiner, repeating his story. He didn't know where they were. He loved them. He just wanted them home. The examiner strapped the sensors to him and began the test. The results were immediate and catastrophic. The needles on the graph went wild. It was, the examiner would later say, one of the most deceptively indicated tests he had ever administered. Chris was lying about everything. The examiner confronted him. "You're not being honest with me, Chris. The test shows you are lying. You know what happened to them." Chris's calm facade began to crack. He put his hand in his hands. The detectives entered the room. "It's time to tell the truth," they said. "We know you're involved." But Chris wasn't ready to tell the whole truth. He was going to construct one more horrifying lie. He asked to speak to his father, Ronnie Watts, who was waiting at the station. The detectives, sensing a break, allowed it. With his father in the room, Chris began to weep. And then he spun his second story, a story designed to paint himself as a victim, a story that deflected the worst of the blame onto the woman he had already silenced. I came home," he stammered, "and I saw Shanann on the baby monitor. She was taking care of Cece." His father, confused, asked what he meant. She did something to them," Chris whispered. "And then I lost it. I went into a rage, and I did the same thing to her." It was a monstrous, calculated lie. He was claiming that Shanann, the devoted mother, had taken the lives of her own daughters, and that he, in a fit of righteous fury, had then taken hers. He was attempting to use his deceased wife as a shield for his own actions. The detectives, while privately disgusted, saw this as an opening. They pressed him. If that's what happened, where are they? Chris Watts finally broke. He agreed to show them. He told them he had taken his family to a remote oil work site, a place known as Survey 319, one of the many desolate, sprawling fields owned by Anadarko Petroleum. As the sun began to set on August 15th, a grim procession of law enforcement vehicles followed Chris Watts' truck down a long, dark dirt road. The site was miles from anything, a place of stark, industrial silence, punctuated only by the hum of machinery and the chirping of insects. Chris, now in handcuffs, walked the investigators to the site. He pointed to a patch of freshly disturbed earth near a cluster of oil tanks. "Shanann is right here," he said, his voice flat. As investigators began the delicate work of uncovering the shallow grave, Chris stared at the two massive 20-foot-tall oil tanks. "The girls," he said, "are in there." The horror of what he had done settled upon the investigators. He hadn't just disposed of his daughters. He had submerged them inside two separate tanks full of crude oil. The recovery operation was agonizing. It took hours. First, they recovered Shanann's body from the grave. She was wrapped in a sheet from their bed. Then, the crews had to drain the thick, toxic sludge from the tanks. The first tank was opened. A worker looked inside and recoiled. There, floating in the oil, was the small body of Bella Watts. They drained the second tank. There was Celeste. The little girls, aged 4 and 3, had been pushed through the 8-inch-wide thief hatches at the top of the tanks. The autopsy would later reveal the full, heartbreaking story. Bella had bite marks on her tongue. She had fought for her life. The cause of their passing was determined to be asphyxiation. He had smothered them with his bare hands. Shanann and her unborn son, Nico, had also been asphyxiated. The why was now agonizingly clear. He hadn't snapped. This wasn't a fit of rage. This was a cold, calculated plan to annihilate his entire family, to clear the slate for a new life. He had taken their lives in their own home, one by one. He had then lived with them in the house for hours before loading them into his work truck, placing his daughters on the floor of the cab, and driving them, along with their mother, to the oil field where he worked every day. He had buried his wife, and then, in a final act of desecration, he had dropped his children, one by one, into the oil tanks, sealing their fate. He then went about his day, calling his daughter's school to unenroll them, texting his mistress, and playing the part of the concerned husband. The public revelation of the crimes sent a shockwave not just through Colorado, but across the world. The story was a toxic cocktail of everything that fascinates and repels the public. A beautiful family, a secret affair, and an act of unfathomable cruelty. The family that had looked so perfect on Facebook was revealed to be a lie, curated by a loving mother and destroyed by a sociopathic father. Nicole Kessinger, the mistress, came forward. She had contacted the police herself, sensing something was wrong when she saw Chris on the news. She was horrified. She told investigators that Chris had lied to her from the beginning, claiming he was at the end of a mutual separation. She had no idea he was a monster. The legal case against Chris Watts was overwhelming. The neighbor's camera, the phone records, the affair, the failed polygraph, and, most importantly, the discovery of the bodies at his direction. The Weld County District Attorney, Michael Rourke, announced he would be seeking the death penalty. On November 6, 2018, just 3 months after the events, Chris Watts appeared in court. To avoid a long, agonizing trial and the death penalty, he pleaded guilty to all 9 counts against him. 5 counts of first-degree offenses, 1 for each person plus 2 for the children under 12, 1 count of unlawful termination of a pregnancy, and 3 counts of tampering with a deceased human body. The plea deal was made in consultation with Shanann's family, the Ruzeks. They did not want to endure a trial. They did not want to see the horrifying evidence. But most of all, they agreed to take the death penalty off the table for one reason. They wanted to ensure he would spend every single day of the rest of his life in a cell, thinking about what he had done. On November 19, 2018, the sentencing hearing took place. The courtroom was packed, the silence heavy with grief. Shanann's father, Frank Ruzek, spoke first. "I am heartbroken, and I have trusted you to take care of them, not take them from us," he said, his voice thick with emotion as he looked at Chris. "You disgust me. You heartlessly took their lives. They also loved you, but you took their lives." Shanann's mother, Sandra Ruchek, was defiant. "We loved you like a son. We are trusting you to take care of them. I have no idea who you are." She described her daughter as a fireball who dreamed of being a mom. The prosecutor, Michael Rourke, then delivered a chilling, detailed account of the crimes, revealing the full, cold-blooded nature of the plan. He described how Chris had smothered his daughters, how Bella had walked in after he had finished with Celeste, asking, "What's wrong with Cece?" He described how he had put his wife's body in the truck, and how his 2 daughters, still alive at this point, had been taken on that 45-minute drive to the oil field. The courtroom listened in stunned horror as Rourke explained that Chris had first taken Shanann's life. After his daughters saw him wrapping their mother in a sheet, he put them in the truck. He drove to Survey 319, he buried his wife, then, one by one, he took his daughters from the truck. He smothered Celeste with her favorite blue blanket and dropped her into the tank. He returned for Bella, who, according to Chris's later confession, looked at him and said, "Daddy, no." He did the same to her. This was not a rage. This was an extermination. The judge, Marcelo A. Kopkow, his voice shaking with anger, delivered the sentence. "This is perhaps the most inhumane and vicious crime I have handled out of the thousands of cases I have seen." He sentenced Chris Watts to 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole,
plus 2 more life sentences to be served concurrently, 48 years for the unlawful termination of a pregnancy, and 36 years for tampering with the bodies. Chris Watts was led away in chains, destined to spend the rest of his natural life in prison. He was transferred to an out-of-state facility, the Dodge Correctional Institution in Waupun, Wisconsin, for his own safety. In the months and years that followed, the why continued to haunt the public. The answer, it seemed, was as shallow as it was horrifying. He did it for a fresh start. He did it to be with another woman. He did it to escape a $400,000 mortgage. From prison, Chris Watts gave more details in a chilling 5-hour-long interview with investigators. He finally admitted his second story, the one where he blamed Shanann, was a complete fabrication. He admitted he had been planning it. He said he had smothered Shanann in their bed after she confronted him about the affair. He said that when he was loading her body into the truck, his daughters woke up and came downstairs. This detail made the crime even more monstrous. Bella and Celeste, confused, watched their father wrap their mother in a sheet. They were not harmed at home. They were alive when he put them in the truck, forced to sit at the feet of their deceased mother for the 45-minute drive to the oil field. They were witnesses to their own abduction, driven to their final destination by their own father. The house on Saratoga Trail, the symbol of their perfect life, became a dark monument. It sat empty for years, a dark tourism site, as the bank foreclosed on it. It was eventually sold at auction, a home forever stained by the events that occurred within its walls. The case of Chris Watts resonates so deeply because it shatters our most fundamental assumptions. It attacks the very idea of family and safety. We are taught to fear the stranger in the alley, the monster under the bed. We are not taught to fear the loving father, the quiet husband, the man who smiles in family photos. Shanann Watts had built an entire world on social media, projecting an image of happiness and success. But the person she was projecting it with was a stranger, a man capable of a coldness that defied human comprehension. He didn't just want a divorce, he wanted an erasure. He wanted to wipe his entire family off the map so he could start over, unburdened by debt, unburdened by love, unburdened by his own children. The ultimate betrayal was not the affair, it was the calculation. It was the moment a father looked at his 2 beautiful, innocent daughters and saw them not as human beings to be cherished, but as problems to be solved. And the solution he chose was unthinkable. Union, South Carolina, is a town carved from the red clay of the Piedmont region. It's a place built on 2 pillars, textile mills and tradition. In 1994, it was a town grappling with change. The hum of the mills, which had provided a steady rhythm of life for generations, was beginning to quiet down, a sign of economic shifts that left many feeling uncertain. But despite this, Union remained a place of deep roots and shared history. It was a small, insular community where everyone knew your name, your parents' names, and your grandparents' names. News traveled fast, not through the internet, which was still in its infancy, but over backyard fences, in church pews, and at the local diner. It was a town that believed in simple truths: hard work, family, and faith. The outside world, with its complex, frightening dangers, felt very far away. The greatest threat in Union was unemployment, not unthinkable violence. And the most sacred figures in this traditional landscape were the mothers, the matriarchs, who held the fabric of the community together. Susan Smith was, by all appearances, one of these mothers. At 23, she was young, with a bright, girlish smile and a quiet demeanor. She was known around town as a sweet, if somewhat troubled, young woman. She was married to David Smith, her high school sweetheart, and they had 2 beautiful little boys, Michael, 3 years old, and Alex, just 14 months. Michael was the older one, a sensitive and loving child. Alex was the baby, just learning to explore the world. To the residents of Union, they were adorable, a familiar sight around town. Susan seemed, at least on the surface, to be a devoted mother. She dressed them in matching outfits, her car was filled with their toys, and her life appeared to revolve around them.
But the reality of Susan Smith's life was far from this simple domestic picture. Her own childhood had been a landscape of profound trauma. Her father had taken his own life when she was just 6, an event that left a permanent scar. Her adolescence was marked by turmoil and accusations of deep, personal betrayal by her stepfather, a prominent figure in the community. She was a young woman carrying an immense weight of unspoken pain, a person who had never been taught how to cope with her own despair. Her marriage to David Smith was crumbling. They were separated, their relationship a cycle of passionate reconciliations and bitter arguments. They were both young, lost, and struggling to navigate adulthood with the heavy burden of 2 small children. David, though he loved his boys, was not always a stable presence. Susan was often left alone, feeling overwhelmed, isolated, and financially strapped. In the fall of 1994, Susan was involved in a new relationship, one that she believed held the promise of an escape. She was seeing a young man named Tom Findley, the son of one of the wealthiest and most powerful families in town. He represented stability, money, and a different kind of life. But there was a complication. In a letter he had written to her, Tom had made it clear that while he cared for her, he was not ready for a ready-made family. He didn't want the responsibility of her children. For Susan Smith, a woman desperate for love and stability, this was a devastating rejection. Her children, the 2 little boys who adored her, had become, in her fractured mind, the obstacle standing between her and the life she craved. On the evening of October 25, 1994, this quiet, troubled young mother made a decision that would not only end 2 innocent lives, but would also tear her town apart and hold a nation captive in a 9-day lie. The call came into the Union County 911 dispatch at 9:12 p.m. The voice on the other end was hysterical, a woman's shriek of pure primal terror. It was Susan Smith. "Please help me, she screamed. "A man has taken my car, and my babies are in it." She told the dispatcher a story that was every parent's single worst nightmare. She said she had been sitting at a red light at the intersection of Highway 49 and Monarch Road, a quiet, lonely stretch of pavement. A man, she claimed, had suddenly appeared. He had jumped into her burgundy Mazda Protege, ordered her out of the vehicle at gunpoint, and then sped away. Her 2 little boys, Michael and Alex, were asleep in their car seats in the back. The story was horrifying. A young mother stranded on a dark road, watching her car and her children disappear into the night. The law enforcement response was immediate and massive. Sheriff Howard Wells, a respected, no-nonsense lawman, mobilized his entire department. Roadblocks were set up. A "Be on the lookout" BOLO alert was issued for the burgundy Mazda. The FBI was called in within hours. Susan Smith, wrapped in a blanket, was brought to the sheriff's department. She was inconsolable, weeping and shaking. Detectives, their hearts breaking for her, gently asked her to describe the assailant. She gave them a description that would soon be broadcast on every television screen in America. The carjacker, she said, was a black man in his late 20s or early 30s. He was wearing a dark-colored toboggan cap, a plaid shirt, and jeans. He was, she emphasized, an unknown stranger who had appeared out of the darkness. The next morning, the sun rose on a town gripped by fear and unified in purpose. The search for Michael and Alex Smith became the single focus of the entire community. Volunteers poured in, combing through fields, forests, and back roads. The local media picked up the story, and within 24 hours, it was no longer a local tragedy. It was a national obsession. The image of the 2 smiling, innocent boys was everywhere. The story tapped into the deepest fears of suburban and small-town America. The fear of the stranger, the random act of violence, the predator lurking in the shadows. And at the center of this media storm was Susan Smith. Her performance was, in a word, convincing. She was the perfect portrait of a devastated mother. She appeared at press conferences, her estranged husband David by her side, their hands clasped in a show of unified grief. She looked into the cameras, her eyes red-rimmed,
her voice trembling, and she spoke directly to the man she had invented. "Please," she sobbed, "I pray to God that you'll just let my babies come home. They're so little." The nation wept with her. This was not the cold, detached performance of a Chris Watts. This was a raw, emotional, and seemingly authentic plea. She was a mother in agony. And then she delivered the line that would later be remembered for its gut-wrenching, calculated cruelty. "Michael and Alex," she cried, "your mommy loves you so much. My children wanted me, they needed me, and I wasn't there for them. I wasn't there." It was a masterful performance. She was not only playing the victim, she was confessing, hiding her guilt in plain sight, phrasing her literal failure as a mother's heartfelt lament. She was the grieving victim, tormented by her inability to protect her children from the monster she had created. The manhunt for the bushy-haired stranger, as the media began to call him, though her description was of a man in a cap, intensified.
It was a search based entirely on a lie. Law enforcement resources were poured into a futile chase. Investigators, acting on her description, began questioning black men in and around Union, creating a cloud of suspicion over an entire segment of the community. The case was feeding into and reinforcing dangerous racial stereotypes, all while the real perpetrator was crying on television. David Smith, the father, was also on TV, his face a mask of bewildered pain. He too pleaded for his sons. "We just want 'em back," he said, his voice cracking. "Whatever you want, you can have. Just please don't hurt my boys. They're all I have."
He had no idea he was a pawn in his wife's elaborate theater. For 9 days the search continued. For 9 days, Susan Smith lived out her lie. She went to church, where the congregation prayed for her. She consulted with a police sketch artist, helping to create a composite drawing of the non-existent carjacker. This drawing was then blasted across the country. She seemed to be doing everything a grieving mother should do. But behind the scenes, the investigators were growing uneasy. Sheriff Howard Wells, a man with decades of experience, felt that something was wrong. Her story, while horrific, was also thin. The details were fuzzy.
The red light at that intersection was known to be a rolling stop for locals. No one, especially a mother with children at 9 p.m., would sit there long enough for an attacker to emerge from the woods. The description of the attacker was generic, almost a caricature. And Susan's behavior, while emotional, was also inconsistent. In her interviews with detectives, she would be wailing one moment and then strangely calm and composed the next. She seemed to be able to turn the tears on and off. They decided to administer a polygraph test. This was the turning point. Susan Smith failed the first polygraph, miserably.
When confronted with the results, she became agitated, claiming the machine was wrong, that her grief was interfering with the readings. They tested her again. She failed again. The detective's suspicions now hardened into certainty. They brought in David, her husband. They tested him. He passed. The investigators knew. The nation was searching for a phantom, while the person responsible was the one who had sent them on the chase. But they had no bodies. They had no car. They had only the word of a polygraph, which was not admissible in court. They needed a confession. For 9 days, Sheriff Wells and his team walked a delicate line. They had to maintain the public charade of the search, keeping the hope alive, while in private, they began to systematically dismantle Susan Smith's story. They re-interviewed her over and over. They poked holes in her timeline. They pointed out the inconsistencies. They also discovered the motive. They learned about Tom Findley, the wealthy boyfriend. They found the letter, the one where he had stated he wasn't ready to be a father. The why was suddenly, tragically clear. On the 9th day, November 3rd, 1994, the charade was over. Sheriff Wells sat down with Susan Smith in an interview room. He was not aggressive. He was almost paternal. He looked at this 23-year-old young woman
who was herself a damaged child, and he appealed to the only thing she might have left, her conscience. He told her they knew. He told her they knew there was no carjacker. He told her it was time to stop. "Susan," he said, his voice gentle, "it's time to tell the truth. It's time to do it for Michael and Alex. They deserve that." For a long time, she just stared, her face blank. The tears she had summoned so easily for the cameras were gone. There was only a cold, hollow emptiness. And then she began to talk. The confession was quiet, mundane, and all the more horrifying for it. There was no carjacker. There was no man at the red light. She said she had been feeling overwhelmed, despondent, and hopeless. She felt her life was a dead end. She saw her children as the source of her pain, the anchor that kept her from the life she wanted with Tom Findlay. That evening, she had driven her 2 boys, not to a red light, but to the quiet, dark shores of John D. Long Lake, a popular local recreation spot. She parked her car on the boat ramp, the front wheels pointed toward the water. For a time, she just sat there, the car idling. Michael, 3 years old, was in his car seat. Alex, 14 months, was beside him. She got out of the car. She walked to the edge of the ramp, her mind racing, her heart, in her own words, aching. She stood there for several minutes, the crickets chirping in the background, the lake water dark and still. Then she walked back to the driver's side door. She reached in, put her hand on the gear shift, and moved it into neutral. She released the emergency brake. She took her hand off, stepped back, and watched. The burgundy Mazda Protégé began to roll, slowly at first, then picking up speed as it hit the incline of the ramp. It entered the water, the splash echoing in the night air. The car did not sink immediately. It floated for a moment, a dark shape on the water, before the front end dipped down. The back end, where her children were strapped into their seats, rose up briefly, before it too was pulled under the dark surface. She watched until the last ripple disappeared. Then she turned around and began to run. She ran down the dark road, hysterical, practicing the story she would tell the 911 dispatcher, the story she would tell her husband, her town, and the entire nation. She was no longer a mother. She was an actress, and she was about to take center stage. The confession was a cataclysm. Sheriff Wells, a stoic veteran, had to leave the room, physically ill from what he had just heard. The news broke. The nation, which had been united in prayer for Susan Smith, was now united in sheer, unadulterated rage. The grief turned to vitriol. The woman they had wept with was not a victim. She was a monster of a kind they could not comprehend. The bushy-haired stranger had been a fabrication, a racist diversion to cover an act of unspeakable cruelty. Divers were sent to John D. Long Lake. They found the car exactly where she said it would be, 18 feet below the surface. They brought it up. And inside, they found the 2 little boys, still strapped in their car seats, their small hands holding each other. The trial of Susan Smith in the summer of 1995 was not a trial to determine guilt. Her confession was absolute. It was a trial to determine her fate. The prosecution, led by Solicitor Tommy Pope, argued for the death penalty. They painted a picture of a cold, narcissistic, and selfish woman who had calculatingly eliminated her children for a man who didn't even want her. They replayed her crocodile tears for the jury, contrasting her public grief with her cold confession. The defense, led by David Brooke, did not try to excuse her actions. Instead, they tried to explain the woman. They presented a harrowing portrait of her life, a life defined by the trauma of her father's passing and the alleged abuse she suffered at the hands of her stepfather. They argued that Susan Smith was not a monster. She was a deeply, profoundly broken human being. They argued that her mind had been shattered by a lifetime of pain, and that, in her final, desperate act, she had tried to end her own life, but had, in a twisted, horrifying way, taken her children's instead. The jury, composed of residents of Union, had to decide.
Was she the manipulative, selfish creature the prosecution described, or the broken victim the defense portrayed? They deliberated, and in the end, they chose mercy. They could not bring themselves to sentence the young woman they had watched grow up to the same fate she had given her children. They found her guilty, but they spared her life, sentencing her to life in prison. Susan Smith was sent to the Leith Correctional Institution, where she remains today. She will be eligible for parole in 2024. The case of Susan Smith left an indelible scar on the American psyche. It was, in many ways, the end of an era of innocence. It was one of the first high-profile cases of the 24-hour news cycle, a story that played out in real time for a captive audience. And it taught that audience a hard, cynical lesson. It taught us to be suspicious. It taught us that the most heart-wrenching plea on television, the most devastating display of public grief, could be nothing more than a performance. Her performance was, in its own way, far more sinister than that of Chris Watts. Watts was a bad actor. His detachment was obvious. But Susan Smith was a good actor. She was believable. She cried real tears. She knew the words to say, the emotions to project. She tapped into the heart of a nation and manipulated it with chilling precision. She didn't just take the lives of her two sons. For 9 days, she held the entire country hostage with a lie. She weaponized her motherhood, her victimhood, and the prejudices of her community to cover an act of unimaginable selfishness. The tears she shed for the camera were not tears of grief. They were tears of performance, the crocodile tears of a woman who had just watched her own children sink into the dark, cold water. Springfield, Oregon, May 19, 1983. It's a quiet, working-class town nestled in the lush Willamette Valley. This is logging country, a place of tall firs and misty mornings. Life here is straightforward, unadorned. People work hard, raise their families, and find comfort in the familiar rhythms of the Pacific Northwest. The world of media sensations, of complex, dark psychologies, feels a world away, something that belongs to the sprawling concrete landscapes of Los Angeles or New York. On this spring night, the air was cool and dark. Shortly before 10:30 p.m., a small red sedan sputtered to a stop at the emergency room entrance of Mackenzie Willamette Hospital. The driver's side door flew open, and a woman stumbled out, shouting for help. Her name was Diane Downs. She was 27 years old, a postal carrier who had recently moved to the area. She was frantic, distressed, and she had an injury to her left forearm. "Help!" she screamed at the hospital staff who rushed out. "Somebody, my kids!" The staff looked inside the red car, and their blood ran cold. The interior of the car was a scene of unbelievable carnage. 3 small children were slumped in the vehicle, covered in crimson. Cheryl, 7 years old, was already gone. She had no pulse. Christy, 8 years old, was gravely wounded, but still breathing. Danny, just 3 years old, was also catastrophically injured. Diane Downs herself had a single, neat wound in her forearm. As the medical team sprang into action, wheeling the children into the trauma bay in a desperate, futile effort to save Cheryl and a frantic one to save Christy and Danny, Diane Downs told her story. It was a story that would, for a time, terrify the entire state of Oregon. She said she had been driving with her 3 children on a dark, rural back road, Old Mohawk Road, just outside of Springfield. She was taking them for a scenic drive, she said. Suddenly, she claimed, a man had flagged her down, a stranger standing in the middle of the road. She described him as a bushy-haired stranger. She said this man, with wild hair and a desperate look, had tried to take her car. When she refused, he produced a weapon. He had opened fire, she claimed, shooting her in the arm, and then, systematically, shooting her 3 children. He then tried to reach for her keys, she said, before running off into the darkness, vanishing as quickly as he had appeared. Diane, with her injured arm, claimed she had then driven her children on a slow, agonizing journey to the hospital, her car sputtering, her children's lives fading with every mile. It was a story of a mother's worst nightmare, a random, senseless act of violence on a lonely country road. The entire community was horrified, gripped by the fear of a bushy-haired stranger who was armed, dangerous, and still at large. The Lane County Sheriff's Office, led by Detective Dick Tracy and his partner, Detective Wellstad, immediately responded. They secured the car as evidence. They went to the hospital to get a more detailed statement from the only witness, the grieving mother. But from the very first encounter, something was profoundly wrong. The detectives, accustomed to the raw, visceral, and often incoherent shock of trauma victims, were met with something else entirely. Diane Downs was calm. She was unnervingly, bizarrely calm. Just moments after arriving at the hospital, as her children were being worked on, she was observed not weeping, not in a state of shock, but simply waiting. When a nurse tried to console her, Diane reportedly made a strange comment about her new car, now ruined. In the formal interview, she recounted the attack with a chilling lack of emotion. She told the story of the bushy-haired stranger in a flat, monotone voice, as if she were reciting a grocery list. There were no tears. There was no hysteria. There was no panic. Detectives are trained to look for inconsistencies. With Diane Downs, the entire person was an inconsistency. Her behavior did not match the horror of the event she had just survived. While one child was gone and 2 others were fighting for their lives, Diane's primary concern seemed to be herself. She was focused on her arm, on the details of the story, on how the events were perceived. The suspicion in the minds of the detectives was immediate and overwhelming. This was not a grieving mother. This was something else. They began their investigation, and her story started to fall apart almost as soon as they looked at it. They examined the car. The blood spatter patterns inside the vehicle told a story that did not match Diane's. The sheer amount of blood suggested the events had happened in a static, confined space. The forensics did not support a frantic through-the-window attack by a stranger. They found the weapon, not at the scene, but in Diane's home. It was a .22 caliber pistol. Ballistics tests would later match the casings found in her car and the projectiles taken from the children to this exact weapon. They found her diary. And in her diary, they did not find the writings of a content, loving mother. They found the obsessive, desperate scribblings of a woman fixated on a man. His name was Robert Nick Knickerbocker. He was a married man from Arizona, where Diane had lived before moving to Oregon. Diane had been having an affair with him, and Nick, she wrote, had made one thing very clear to her. He liked her, but he did not want children. He would never leave his wife for a woman who came with baggage. In her diary, Diane wrote, "I'd do anything to be with him." The motive, so often a mystery, was laid bare in her own handwriting. Her children, Cheryl, Christy, and Danny, were not her family. They were baggage. They were the obstacles standing between her and the man she was obsessed with. The detectives in Lane County now had a new theory. A theory far more horrifying than the bushy-haired stranger. They believed that Diane Downs, in a cold, calculated act, had attempted to remove the baggage from her life. She had driven her children to that dark, lonely road, not for a scenic drive, but for an execution. They believed she had systematically shot her 3 children, and then, to create her survivor story, had discharged the weapon into her own left forearm, a superficial wound designed to lend credibility to her tale. But there was one major problem. They had no witness. It was her word against their circumstantial evidence. Cheryl was gone. Danny, who had survived, was too young to communicate what happened. That left Christy, 8-year-old Christy. Christy had survived, but just barely. The projectile had entered her body, causing a devastating stroke. She was unable to speak. She was partially paralyzed. She was a prisoner inside her own damaged body. The prosecutor on the case, Fred Hughey, knew that the entire case rested on this one fragile, silent witness.
He began to visit Christy in the hospital. He would sit by her bed, talking to her, showing her pictures, trying to see if there was anything left, any way for her to communicate. For weeks, she was unresponsive. But slowly, a flicker of recognition appeared. She could squeeze his hand. She could nod. Hughie, in a moment of profound, gentle questioning, began. "Christy," he asked, "do you remember who shot you?" A nod. He began to list names. Was it a stranger? A shake of the head. No. Was it Danny? No. Was it Cheryl? No. Was it your mom? The small 8-year-old head nodded. Yes. It was the breakthrough. It was the confirmation. The bushy-haired stranger did not exist. The attacker was their mother. While this quiet, agonizing confirmation was happening in the hospital, Diane Downs was, astoundingly, doubling down on her performance. But her performance was not one of grief. It was one of baffling, narcissistic detachment. Just days after the event, while Christy and Danny were still in critical condition, Diane Downs agreed to a televised press conference. The nation, already horrified by the crime, tuned in, expecting to see a mother shattered by grief, a woman broken by the random cruelty of the world. What they saw was one of the most bizarre and self-incriminating interviews in modern history. Diane Downs sat before the cameras, her arm in a sling. She was not crying. She was smiling. She was giggling. She calmly and at times flirtatiously recounted the attack. She spoke in a strange, high-pitched, sing-song voice. "I got a good look at his face," she said, almost brightly, of the non-existent attacker. He had bushy, shaggy hair. When a reporter asked her how she felt, she did not speak of her children. She spoke of herself. "It makes you feel empty inside. My arm it hurts so bad." But the most chilling moment came when she attempted to articulate her grief for her children. She paused, looked at the cameras, and delivered a line that was a universal way from Susan Smith's believable tears. "When you have children," she said, with a thoughtful, detached air, you want to be able to give them the one thing. You know, that they're safe. And I failed, you know?" She did not weep. She did not choke up. She analyzed her failure with the emotional engagement of a student discussing a failed math test. And then she did something that stunned the entire room. She smiled again and reenacted the moment, holding up her injured arm. He just went bang and bang, just like that. The public was repulsed. This was not grief. This was not shock. This was a performance. But it was the performance of a narcissist so complete that she could not even comprehend how a normal, grieving human being was supposed to act. She was not playing the victim well. She was playing herself, a person for whom everything, even the loss of her children, was just a scene in her own personal movie. While the police were building their case, Diane's behavior grew more erratic, more celebratory. She was free. Her baggage was gone. She was seen dating. She took a job where she could be seen. She seemed to be reveling in the attention, enjoying her new life as a tragic, media-friendly victim. She even called Nick Knickerbocker in Arizona, the man for whom she had done this. She told him what happened, perhaps expecting sympathy, or perhaps expecting him to be impressed by the lengths she had gone to. Nick, horrified, immediately contacted the police and told them everything he knew. He confirmed her obsession. He confirmed he had told her he didn't want children. He became a key witness for the prosecution. On February 28, 1984, more than 9 months after the event, Diane Downs was finally arrested. She was 9 months pregnant. During the time she was out on bail, she had become involved with another man, believing that having a new baby would somehow prove to the world what a loving mother she was. The trial of Diane Downs began in May 1984. It was a media sensation. The courtroom was packed. Diane, who had just given birth to her new daughter, the baby was quickly taken and adopted, was the star of her own show. She would show up to court in bright, fashionable outfits, smiling and waving for the cameras. The prosecution, led by Fred Hugi, laid out its case with methodical precision. They presented the forensic evidence from the car. They presented the weapon found in her home. They presented her diaries with their chilling odes to Nick Knickerbocker and her description of her children as obstacles. They put Nick on the stand, who testified to her obsessive, frightening desperation. But the most powerful moment of the trial, the moment that silenced the entire courtroom, was the testimony of Christy Downs. Now 9 years old, Christy had regained her ability to speak, though her voice was soft and halting. She had to fight against the damage to her brain to form the words. She took the stand. Fred Hugi walked up to her. He gently asked her to recall the night of May 19, 1983. He asked her who was in the car. "Me," Christy said, "and Danny, and Cheryl." "And who else?" Hugi asked. "My mom." And then Hugi asked the final, devastating question. "And Christy, who shot you?" The little girl looked out, her eyes finding her mother in the courtroom. Diane Downs stared back, her face a cold, blank mask. Christy's voice was small, but clear. "My mom." It was the sound of the entire case locking into place. The lie of the bushy-haired stranger was annihilated by the small, brave voice of the child who had survived her. Diane Downs' defense was as bizarre as her interviews. Her attorney argued that the bushy-haired stranger was real. They tried to claim the police had botched the investigation, that they had ignored evidence. But then Diane herself decided to take the stand. It was a catastrophic mistake. For days, she was cross-examined by Fred Hugi, and the world saw, up close, the woman the detectives had seen. She was argumentative, she was narcissistic, she was sarcastic, and she was utterly devoid of emotion. She couldn't keep her story straight. She contradicted herself. She giggled at inappropriate moments. She blamed the police, she blamed her ex-husband, she blamed Nick Knickerbocker. She even seemed to blame her children. But the most damning moment came when Hugi confronted her with her own diary. He read aloud the words, "I'd do anything to be with him." And then he asked her, "Did anything include harming your own children?" Diane Downs, the woman who had smiled for the cameras, just stared back, her arrogance finally cracking, replaced by a flash of pure, cold rage. The jury saw it all. They deliberated for just 6 hours. The verdict was guilty on all counts. Guilty of 1 count of a final act and 2 counts of attempted final acts. The sentencing was a few weeks later. Diane Downs, still defiant, addressed the court. She did not apologize. She did not ask for mercy. She maintained her innocence, her voice dripping with contempt. "I hope in the years to come," she said, "that I will be able to be with my children again." The judge, Foote, was unmoved. He looked at Diane Downs and delivered a sentence that was both a punishment and a societal necessity. "You are sentenced to life in prison, plus 50 years, he said, ensuring she would never, ever be free again. "I do not find that you are a candidate for rehabilitation. You will remain a threat to others." As she was led out of the courtroom, she passed the prosecutor, Fred Hugi. "You'll be sorry," she hissed at him. But the story does not end there. Diane Downs was incarcerated, but her narcissism, her belief that she was the main character, never wavered. In 1987, 3 years into her sentence, she did something that seemed impossible. She escaped. She scaled a 15-foot razor wire fence at the Oregon Women's Prison and vanished. For 10 days, she was the subject of a massive manhunt, the most notorious woman in America, on the loose. She was eventually found, hiding in a nearby home, and was returned to a much more secure facility. Her 2 surviving children, Christy and Danny, were adopted by the prosecutor, Fred Hugi, and his wife, Joanne.
In an act of profound love and healing, the man who had put their mother away became their father. He gave them the safety and love that Diane Downs had been incapable of. They grew up, changed their names, and have lived quiet, private lives, forever bonded by the trauma they survived. The baby girl Diane was pregnant with at the time of her arrest, whom she named Hope, was adopted by a loving family and named Becky. She grew up with no knowledge of her biological mother, but as a young woman, she felt a pull to understand her origins, which eventually led her to the horrifying truth. Diane Downs, now in her late 60s, remains in prison in California. She is, by all accounts, unchanged. She still maintains her innocence. She still blames the bushy-haired stranger. She still believes she is the victim, a mother wrongly torn from her children. Her case is a chilling study in the outer limits of narcissism. It's a stark contrast to the other two performances. Chris Watts was a bad actor, his guilt obvious in his detachment. Susan Smith was a good actor, her performance of grief so convincing it fooled a nation. But Diane Downs was something else. She was an alien actor. She was a person so fundamentally disconnected from normal human emotion, from love, from empathy, from grief, that she could not even conceive of how to fake it. Her performance wasn't a lie. It was a revelation. It was the unfiltered, unmasked display of a personality that saw other human beings, even her own children, as nothing more than props in her story, to be kept or discarded as they served her needs. The crocodile tears of Chris Watts and Susan Smith were designed to hide the truth. Diane Downs's bizarre, smiling performance was the truth. It was the truth of a hollow, empty soul, a person who had eliminated her own children and then calmly, almost cheerfully, drove to the hospital to deliver her lines.